It was Thursday, November 6th, 1980. The kind of night Manchester remembers, cold, wet, and heavy with fog that pressed low against the rooftops. In the city center, street lamps burned like dull halos, their glow swallowed quickly by the mist. By 11 p.m., the streets near St. Anne's Square were quiet. Most shops shuttered, the only sound the drip of rainwater down Victorian stone. But parked on a narrow side street, a dark Ford Transit van idled, its engine humming softly. Inside sat three men. Their names, as investigators would later piece together, were Daniel Mercer, Patrick Doyle, and Alan Hughes. Small-time criminals, yes. But that night, they were about to step into something much larger. Their target was the Midland County Bank, a century-old building that stood proudly with granite columns and brass doors polished daily. It wasn't the biggest bank in Manchester, but it held something precious that week, a payroll delivery mint for several textile factories in the area. By midnight, the vault would contain close to £3 million in cash. Mercer, the ringleader, checked his watch. 23 hours, 23 minutes, he whispered. Timing was everything. At 11:30 p.m., the bank's lone night guard, a man named George Latham, started his usual patrol. George was 52, with a lined face and a slight limp from an old accident. He carried a heavy torch and an old Webley revolver that had never been fired in anger. He moved through the silent halls, marble floors echoing under his steps, the fog pressing hard against the windows. That's when he heard the click of the lock. The front door eased open, and three masked men slipped inside. George barely had time to raise his torch before Mercer shoved him back against the wall. His wrists were bound with rope pulled from the van. The revolver clattered across the marble floor. "Stay quiet," Hughes hissed, his accent cutting through the silence. "Do that, and you'll live." The robbery itself was swift. Doyle carried the tools, a hand drill, a crowbar, and heavy canvas sacks. Hughes moved to the vault, his gloves already blackened with oil. Mercer kept his eye on the clock. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And that, investigators would later say, was the first unsettling detail. These weren't amateurs crashing in blind. They knew the layout. They knew the timing. They knew which night the money would be there. Someone had told them. By 11:37, the vault door was cracked. George Latham, gagged on the floor, could only watch as stacks of cash, neatly wrapped, labeled for payroll, were swept into the sacks. A fortune compressed into canvas. At 11:39, a siren wailed faintly in the distance. For a moment, panic. The three men froze. The sound grew louder, then faded again as the patrol car sped past the square. No one looked up. No one saw the van parked in the mist. By 11:41, the men were gone. The bank stood in silence once more, the fog curling around its doors like smoke. George Latham lay tied, heart pounding, listening to the echo of their footsteps vanish into the city. When detectives arrived, just after dawn, the scene told its story in fragments. Rope fibers, muddy prints smeared across marble, the faint smell of machine oil near the vault hinges. But there were no faces, no names. Only the certainty that millions had vanished into Manchester's underworld. The Manchester Evening News blared the headline, "Fog Bank Heist. Millions stolen in midnight raid." Crowds gathered in St. Anne's Square, staring at the bank's locked doors, whispering about gangs, about the IRA, about shadowy London figures pulling the strings. Detective Inspector Harold Keene, a sharp-eyed veteran of the city CD, studied the vault with quiet fury. The job was too clean, too fast. Whoever opened that vault didn't guess. It was knowledge. Someone inside the bank had helped them. And as the rain fell heavier that weekend, Keene's suspicion deepened. Because late on Friday night, an anonymous letter slid under the door of the police station. The note said, "You're looking for 3 men, but the one who let them in still works at the bank." The heist was no longer just about money. It was about betrayal. The morning after the robbery, Manchester buzzed with disbelief. In pubs, offices, and crowded buses, people asked the same thing. How could a band of masked men strip a vault clean in just 11 minutes? And why had the Midland County Bank, a proud fixture of St. Square, been so vulnerable? Detective Inspector Harold Keene already knew the answer, though he hadn't said aloud. He stood inside the silent bank that Friday morning, his shoes echoing on marble floors now littered with rope fibers and police chalk marks. He studied the vault, its brass handles smudged with glove prints. Then he bent closer, tracing his fingers along the lock. The thieves hadn't forced their way in. The vault had been opened with precision, almost familiarity. By the time the anonymous letter landed under the station door that night, Keene's suspicion hardened into certainty. You're looking for 3 men, but the one who let them in still works at the bank. Saturday, November 8th, the interviews began. The staff of the Midland County Bank filed one by one into the CD's interview room. Clerks in gray suits, tellers with nervous hands, managers who wore their indignation like armor. One by one, they repeated the same lines. "We know nothing. We left before closing. We locked everything properly." But Keene had been a detective long enough to spot the cracks in a story. One crack was Margaret Ellis, a young teller whose salary barely kept her in her small flat near Hume. She'd been flashing new jewelry recently, a gold bracelet that didn't match her modest income. When asked directly about it, she shifted in her chair, her voice dropping. "It was a gift," she muttered. From my cousin." Keene leaned forward, silent, letting the weight of the pause press down. Margaret looked ready to collapse, but in the end, she said nothing more. Another crack came from the bank's assistant manager, Edward Lang, a man in his late 40s with a polished accent and thin spectacles. Lang presented himself as confident, even amused by the line of questioning. But one detail gnawed Keene. Lang had been the last to leave the building on the evening of the robbery. His key matched the one used to open the front doors. When pressed on whether he'd ever misplaced it, Lang gave a small smile. "Detective, I've been in this business for 20 years. I don't misplace things." Yet the false key found in the lock told a different story. By Sunday, the investigation widened. The van used in the robbery had been discovered abandoned in a derelict warehouse near Ancoats. Its seats still smelled of damp wool and cigarette smoke. Fingerprints smeared across the dash, but none matched bank staff. Whoever the robbers were, they'd wiped the most telling surfaces clean. But the van's registration traced back to a scrapyard owned by a man with connections to Patrick Doyle, one of Keene's longtime suspects in Manchester's underworld. The threads were tightening, and still, George Latham, the night guard, haunted the picture, sitting across from detectives. His voice shook as he relived the robbery. They knew the patrol schedule. They knew I'd be in the main hall at 11:30. They even knew which revolver I carried. He looked down, ashamed. I never told anyone. But they knew. Someone was feeding the gang inside information. That much was undeniable. But was it a teller like Margaret? drowning in debt? A manager like Lang, arrogant enough to think he could outsmart police? Or someone else entirely? Someone whose face had yet to emerge? By mid-November, the case spilled into the public. The Manchester Evening News ran with headlines about the inside man, painting the bank as compromised, its staff under suspicion. Crowds gathered daily outside the station, demanding answers. The bank's directors pressed the police privately, urging them to restore the institution's reputation before depositors panicked. And then came the first break. On November 14th, an informant, an addict from Moss Side, known to police as Little Billy, walked in his CID trembling. He claimed he'd overheard two men in a pub bragging about the heist. The names he gave were no surprise to Keene: Daniel Mercer and Patrick Doyle. The same men tied to the scrapyard van. But Billy added something else. They said they had a man on the inside. A posh one. Someone with a suit, who gave them the key. The investigation had shifted from speculation to confirmation. There was an inside man. The question was who, and whether the robbers were still in Manchester at all. Detective Keene leaned back in his chair that night, cigarette smoke curling around his lamp. He looked over the photographs of the suspects, the bank staff, the crumpled letter, and a map of St. Anne's Square. His gut told him the robbery wasn't just about money. It was about connections, ties that reached beyond Manchester's pubs and scrapyards, perhaps even south toward London's crime syndicates. And then came the twist. On the morning of November 16th, the Daily Express ran a shocking claim. Part of the stolen money had already surfaced. Not in Manchester, not even in the north, but in London. Bundles of marked notes from the Midland County Bank vault had been spotted in Soho. If the money had already traveled 200 miles, the inside man wasn't just leaking information. He was moving millions. On the morning of November 16th, 1980, Manchester detectives opened the Daily Express and froze. A headline shouted from the front page: "Banknotes from Manchester Heist surface in London." Beneath it, grainy photographs showed bundles of crisp fivers and tenors spread out on a Soho gambling table. The watermark of the Midland County Bank faint but visible under police light. It was the first tangible proof of where the money had gone. The robbers had not buried it. They had not kept it locked away in some damp cellar in Hume or Ancoats. They had moved it, fast, smooth, efficient, straight into London's underworld. Detective Inspector Harold Keene sat in his Manchester office with a newspaper folded neatly in front of him, cigarette burning down between his fingers. The confirmation was as good as a confession. The robbery was bigger than 3 masked men in a stolen van. The reach stretched 200 miles south, into the hands of people with power. People who could launder millions without flinching. That Monday, Keene traveled to London. The train ride was long, damp with condensation, the carriage windows fogging against November chill. He carried a single brown folder stuffed with photographs, statements, and one anonymous letter. His colleagues stayed behind to keep pressure on the bank staff, but Keene wanted to see the money trail with his own eyes. In Soho, the details were grimly predictable. Police raids on a backroom gambling den had uncovered £42,000 in notes that matched the serial numbers recorded at the Midland County Bank. The club was run by a man named Leon Price, a figure well known to Scotland Yard. Slick suits, a sharp smile, and connections that reached deep into London's rackets. Price had vanished the night of the raid, but his men hadn't. Interrogations with the club's doorman painted a hazy picture. A week earlier, 2 strangers from the north had delivered the cash. They spoke in Mancunian accents. They boasted about the biggest job of the decade. They didn't stay long. One of them, the doorman recalled, had a small scar across his jaw. That detail mattered, because Patrick Doyle, the career criminal Keene had been circling for years, bore a jagged scar exactly there, earned in a pub fight back in '76. Back in Manchester, Doyle's name was already on the board. So was Daniel Mercer. Now they were seen in Soho, moving stolen cash directly into London's pipeline. Keene returned to Manchester with confirmation, but also frustration. They were ahead of him, always 2 steps gone. Meanwhile, the pressure on the bank itself deepened. Edward Lang, the assistant manager, bristled under questioning. His colleagues whispered that he had grown tense, avoiding eye contact, smoking more than usual. Margaret Ellis, the teller, broke down in tears during one interview, insisting she knew nothing, but admitting she'd once seen Lang meeting with rough-looking men near Deansgate weeks before the robbery. Still, nothing concrete, just whispers and suspicions. But then came the most startling discovery yet. In late November, a package arrived at the Manchester CD office. No return address. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a single canvas money bag, the kind used at the Midland County Bank. Stuffed inside were £5,000 in notes. Alongside the cash, a note scrawled in ink. "Look closer at your banker. He isn't what he seems." The room went silent when Keene read it aloud. Who sent the package? Was it a rival criminal trying to tip the scales? A whistleblower inside the gang? Or someone within the bank, panicking as the walls closed in? Keene kept the discovery quiet, sharing it only with his closest team. If Lang was the inside man, the robbers, or their London partners, might already suspect he was cracking. And men like Mercer and Doyle were not known for mercy. By December, the case stood on 2 legs: the trail of money in London and the growing shadow over Edward Lang. The two would have to converge, Keene thought, if the truth was to come out. And then, just before Christmas, a development electrified the investigation. A railway worker in Stockport, checking an abandoned locker at the station, found another canvas sack stuffed with banknotes. Tucked inside was something even more valuable than money: a scrap of paper with numbers scribbled across it. Telephone numbers, London area codes. One of those numbers belonged to Leon Price's gambling den, another to a private office registered in Edward Lang's name. For Keene, the threads had finally knotted together. The bank, the robbers, and the London underworld weren't 3 separate worlds. They were one. And Edward Lang wasn't just careless. He was connected. But how deep did those connections run? And how long before the man who stole millions silenced the man who helped them? By the start of 1981, Manchester was a city divided. On the one hand, people were still buzzing with gossip about the Midland County Bank robbery, the biggest cash theft in living memory. On the other, daily life trudged forward, buses jammed with commuters, shops glowing faintly against gray winter mornings, pubs echoing with football chatter. But beneath it all, there was an unease. Everyone knew millions of pounds had vanished into the fog, and everyone suspected that someone respectable had helped it happen. Detective Inspector Harold Keene no longer spoke in if when it came to the inside man. He spoke in who and how deep. The anonymous package and the locker discovery had pushed him firmly toward Edward Lang, the assistant manager. Lang's position gave him access to keys, schedules, vault details, the very heart of the bank's operations. The scribbled numbers connecting his office to Leon Price's Soho gambling den only hardened the suspicion. But suspicion was not proof. And Edward Lang was careful. Too careful. Keene invited him back for questioning just after New Year's, the frost still clinging to the steps outside the CID office. Lang arrived in a camel hair coat, gloves tucked neatly into his pocket, as if he were stepping into a board meeting rather than a police inquiry. He smiled politely at the detectives, adjusted his spectacles, and sat down without a tremor in his hands. "Mr. Lang," Keene began, laying the paper with the telephone numbers on the table between them. "Can you explain why your office number appears alongside those linked to a London gambling den?" Lang studied the page with a faint squint, then gave a small, dismissive laugh. "Detective, my number is printed in directories. Half of London could have it. I have no idea who scribbled this nonsense." Keene leaned forward. "These numbers were found with stolen bank money, inside a sack identical to those used at the Midland County. That's not a coincidence." Lang's smile thinned, but he did not falter. "You're reaching, Inspector. Perhaps you should spend more time catching thieves, and less time harassing loyal employees." The interview ended with Lang walking out, his coat perfectly buttoned, his pride intact. But Keene saw the flicker in his eyes, that flash of calculation, of someone weighing not whether to confess, but whether his position of safety was slipping. Meanwhile, on the streets, pressure was mounting elsewhere. Detectives trailing Daniel Mercer and Patrick Doyle heard whispers of meetings in Manchester pubs with men tied to London. The kind of men who didn't speak names out loud, who carried themselves with quiet menace. Mercer was seen in Hume with a briefcase he never let out of his grip. Doyle, scar across his jaw, was spotted near the rail station, muttering angrily to a contact who quickly disappeared when approached. The sense was clear. The stolen money was moving fast, filtered south, washed through gambling dens and nightclubs before it vanished in ledgers and offshore accounts. If Keene didn't pin someone soon, the trail would dissolve completely. Then came the intimidation. Margaret Ellis, the young teller, called the police in tears one January night. Someone had slipped a note under her flat door. "Keep quiet. You don't want to end up like the others." When asked what others meant, she sobbed, insisting she didn't know. But Keene suspected. Rumors had already surfaced of minor players tied to the heist turning up battered, vanished, or dead in alleys far from St. Square. The gang was cleaning house. Keene increased surveillance on Edward Lang. What they found was startling. Though Lang drove a modest saloon car and lived in a semi-detached house in Chorlton, he began making quiet late-night trips. Once to a hotel bar near Deansgate, where he met with an unknown man in a leather jacket. Another time to a petrol station just off the M6, where he lingered by the payphone for 20 minutes, eyes darting. And then the breakthrough. A tapped line picked up a brief call from Lang's office. A man's voice, sharp and clipped, asked, "How much longer can you hold them off?" Lang's reply, "As long as I can." But the inspector is pressing hard. It was enough. Not a confession, but a crack in the armor. Lang wasn't just unlucky. He was in it. But who was the voice on the other end? Some said Leon Price, still missing since the Soho raid. Others believed it was someone higher, a fixer in London with the power to keep both police and criminals at bay. In February, an arrest warrant was drafted for Lang. But before it could be served, something unexpected happened. On a rainy Monday morning, Lang didn't arrive at the bank. His colleagues assumed illness. By midday, his wife called police, worried, and by evening, his car was found abandoned near Salford Quays. Empty. Inside, detectives found only his spectacles, snapped in half, lying on the passenger seat. Edward Lang, the suspected inside man of the Manchester Heist, had vanished. Had he run, fearing arrest? Or had the men he once helped decided he knew too much? And if Lang was gone, was the only man who could confirm the truth of the robbery silenced forever? Edward Lang's disappearance rattled Manchester like a hammer blow. The city had already been whispering about the heist for months, but now the whispers turned darker. An inside man gone missing? Spectacles left behind in an abandoned car? It didn't take a detective to sense that someone had tidied up loose ends. Detective Inspector Harold Keene was furious. Lang had been his linchpin, the one man who could bridge the gap between the money on the streets and the bank's heart. Without him, the investigation felt like sand slipping through fingers. But Keene refused to believe Lang had simply run. No banker abandons his family, his career, and leaves behind broken spectacles unless someone else decided his fate. The question became, was Lang hiding under someone's protection, or was he already lying cold in a ditch? Meanwhile, the streets began to rumble. Informants whispered about power struggles within the crew. Daniel Mercer, once careful and deliberate, was now making mistakes. He flashed too much cash at a Moss Side club, buying rounds of whiskey, boasting louder than usual. His partner, Patrick Doyle, was the opposite, edgy, paranoid, and drinking too heavily. Word was, Doyle had accused Mercer of cutting him short on a payout. They were meant to be brothers in arms, but in Manchester, greed splits brothers quicker than bullets. Keen surveillance teams followed Doyle to an abandoned factory in Hume. There, through cracked windows, they spotted a meeting. Doyle, Mercer, and two unknown heavies from London. The argument inside was heated. Doyle slammed his hand on a table. Mercer shoved him back. One of the London men intervened, calm but sharp, reminding them both, the boss doesn't tolerate noise. Keep it quiet, or you'll both be quiet for good. The boss. That one word chilled Keene. Whoever sat above this operation wasn't local. This was bigger than Manchester. The stolen millions weren't sitting under floorboards. They were being funneled through a machine that stretched to London and beyond. Then, in late February, proof of blood surfaced. A fisherman on the River Irwell found a body snagged against the reeds. Male, hands bound, face swollen, teeth smashed. Identification took time, but soon it was confirmed. Patrick Doyle. The scar on his jaw made it certain. The police swarmed the scene. The autopsy showed signs of torture, cigarette burns, broken ribs, prolonged beating before death. Doyle hadn't just been killed. He had been made an example. For Keene, it was both a breakthrough and a nightmare. Doyle's murder screamed one thing. The gang was eating itself alive. Someone had silenced him, likely over money, or over secrets too dangerous to let slip. But with Doyle gone, that left only Mercer. And Mercer was now walking with a target on his back. Still, the death revealed a pattern. Lang vanishes. Doyle turns up dead. Someone was erasing trails. Keene doubled down on Mercer. Detectives followed him day and night. They tracked him into smoky backrooms, pubs thick with cigarette haze, quiet drives to meet cars with London plates. And then one night, Mercer made his boldest move yet. He turned up at a Manchester police station, alone, disheveled, reeking of whiskey, and asked for Detective Inspector Harold Keene by name. Inside an interrogation room, Mercer leaned forward, sweat beading on his forehead. "They're going to kill me next," he said, voice trembling. "You think Doyle was bad? You think Lang just disappeared?" They don't leave survivors. You don't know who you're up against. Keene stared at him. Then tell me, who's behind it? Mercer shook his head. If I speak their name, I'm finished. My family's finished. But I can give you something. A place. Tonight. Sulphur Docks. Warehouse 19. That's where it's moving through. Keene felt the surge of adrenaline. A break. Maybe the break. But he also knew the risks. This could be a trap. Mercer buying time, setting the police up as pawns. That night, under cover of fog, officers crept into Sulphur Docks. Warehouse 19 loomed, shadowy and silent. Inside, crates were stacked high, the smell of salt and oil thick in the air. And then, movement. Men carrying sacks, loading lorries. Not just goods. Money. Bundles of it, wrapped tight, hidden among shipments. For a brief moment, it seemed the police had found the beating heart of the operation. But before they could close in, a shout rang out. Headlights flared. Engines roared. Within minutes, the warehouse exploded into chaos. Men scattering, lorries tearing away, shots fired into the night. By dawn, the police had seized a fraction of the money, arrested 2 small-time carriers. But the real players? Gone. The rest of the fortune vanished into the fog once again. And Daniel Mercer? Nowhere to be found. Had he led police into a trap? Or had he played both sides and paid the price? When the sun rose over Manchester, one thing was clear. The heist was no longer just a robbery. It was a war. And in wars, bodies pile up before truth ever surfaces. The Sulphur Docks raid had been chaos. Engines roaring, bullets tearing through the fog, and crates of cash disappearing into the night. By morning, the city buzzed with rumors. The press called it a botched police sting, while others swore it had been staged to cover up deals between the cops and the criminals. But for Detective Inspector Harold Keene, only one question mattered. Where the hell was Daniel Mercer? The man who had tipped the police off, the supposed insider, had vanished the second the bullets started flying. Some in Keene's squad believed Mercer had lured them into a trap, handing them scraps while the real treasure was smuggled elsewhere. Others believed Mercer himself was a target, already lying in some shallow grave like his partner Doyle. But then, late one night, a phone rang inside Keene's office. A muffled voice. Static on the line. He's alive, but not for long. They put a price on him. If you want him, find him before they do. The line went dead. The message changed everything. Mercer wasn't just hiding. He was running for his life. And someone, somewhere, wanted Keene to know. Meanwhile, Manchester's underworld buzzed with tension. The docks raid had rattled the hierarchy. The money was supposed to move quietly to London, but now it had been scattered. Some said the boss down south was furious, demanding blood. Others whispered the Manchester crew was cursed. First Lang vanished, then Doyle was tortured and dumped, and now Mercer was on the run. Everywhere Keene turned, he found closed doors. Witnesses clammed up, informants disappeared. It was as if a shadow stretched over the city, warning everyone to stay silent. But one thread remained, the warehouse lorries. Police traced one to an abandoned garage near Cheetham Hill. Inside, they found only burned scraps of paper, melted plastic, and the faint smell of gasoline. Evidence, erased with military precision. Whoever ran this operation wasn't sloppy. They were professionals. But Mercer was no professional. He was desperate. In a smoky backstreet pub, he appeared, unshaven, eyes bloodshot, clutching a pint like it was his last. Witnesses later said he was trembling, muttering that they're closing in. He tried to buy a train ticket out of Manchester, but panicked when he saw two men in suits near the platform. He doubled back, vanishing into the city's maze of alleys. The next sighting came from a woman in Hume. She swore Mercer had knocked on her door, begging for a place to hide, offering her rolls of cash in exchange. She turned him away. The next morning, her window was smashed, and a dead rat was left on her doorstep. The message was clear. Anyone helping Mercer would pay. Keene finally caught a break when a courier was picked up carrying a message, a coded note meant for Mercer. It contained a time and place, an old textile mill on the edge of town. The police surrounded it carefully, wary of another trap. But when they stormed the mill, they didn't find an ambush. They found Daniel Mercer, alone, half drunk, and sobbing. He surrendered without a fight. Inside the interrogation room, Mercer was broken. His voice cracked as he spoke. "You don't understand," he whispered. "They don't forgive mistakes." Doyle thought he could skim. Lang thought he could talk. They're both gone. And me, I was next. Keene leaned in. "Then give me a name. Who's behind it?" Mercer shook his head violently. "I can't. If I say it, it won't just be me. My family, my friends, they'll vanish. You don't know what they can do. You don't know how far their reach goes." But before Keene could press further, the interview was interrupted. Orders came down from above. Daniel Mercer was to be moved, quietly, into protective custody. That night, as the transport van carried Mercer across the city, something went wrong. At a deserted junction, a black car cut across the road. Gunfire shattered the silence. When officers fought back, the attackers melted into the night with chilling precision. And when the smoke cleared, the back of the van was empty. Daniel Mercer was gone. Had he been rescued? Or executed? No one knew. All Keene knew was this: the game had changed. If the boss's reach extended far enough to snatch a man out of police custody, then Manchester was up against something bigger than a robbery. This was organized crime on a scale the city had never seen before. And the stolen millions? Still nowhere to be found. Manchester, 1980. The morning after Daniel Mercer vanished from police custody, the city awoke to a new kind of fear. For months, the heist had been a whispered tale of missing millions and bloody betrayals. But now it was something more. A shadow hung over the streets, stretching far beyond Sulphur Docks, far beyond Manchester itself. Detective Inspector Harold Keene sat in his office, chain-smoking, staring at the report. 3 officers injured, 1 dead. Mercer gone. The van hijacked with chilling precision. Whoever orchestrated it had resources, guns, cars, men who didn't hesitate. This wasn't just a gang of dockside thieves. This was the reach of something bigger, something organized, something ruthless. For weeks, Keene's inquiries have been stonewalled. Witnesses too afraid to speak. Files missing. Phone calls cut short. But in the wake of Mercer's disappearance, a crack appeared. An old acquaintance in London, a retired sergeant, called Keene privately. His voice was hushed. "You're not chasing a ghost, Harry. The name you want is William Hawthorne." Hawthorne. The name carried weight in certain circles. A businessman to the public, fleet of lorries, warehouses, even a luxury nightclub in Soho. But in whispered corners, he was something else entirely. The man who pulled strings when others cut throats. The man no one dare cross. Could he be the boss? Keene pushed harder. He sent plainclothes officers to Hawthorne's known properties. They watched deliveries moving at odd hours. They saw armed men standing guard. They caught whispers that Hawthorne had been furious after the docks raid, blaming Manchester's crew for botching a smooth operation. Then came the break. A ledger recovered from a raided safe house. Numbers, routes, and initials. WH. But it was what lay beneath that chilled Keene most. A note in scrawled ink. Mercer compromised. Doyle eliminated. Lang pending. Lang, the original missing man. Had Hawthorne ordered his disappearance? The investigation grew dangerous. One night, as Keene walked to his car, he noticed a figure waiting. A woman, coat pulled tight against the cold. Maria Doyle, widow of the torture man, left in the warehouse. She pressed a folded letter into his hand. "This was slipped under my door last week," she whispered. "I don't know who it's from, but it's about him. About Mercer. About the boss." Inside was a single sentence, typed on clean white paper. The night Lang vanished. A car left for London. Inside was the money, and the man who took it answers only to Hawthorne. The trail led Keene south into London's underworld. He walked through Soho, past neon lights and jazz clubs, to the glittering entrance of the Palladium Room, Hawthorne's pride. Inside, smoke curled around crystal chandeliers. Men in tailored suits drank champagne. Hawthorne sat at the center, silver hair slicked, rings flashing under the lights. He didn't hide. He didn't need to. When Keene tried to approach, a hand blocked his chest. One of Hawthorne's men leaned close, breath of whiskey and smoke. "You've seen enough. Go home, Inspector. Forget Manchester. Forget Mercer, or we'll make sure you do." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Back in Manchester, the walls closed in. Keene's own department grew wary. Files disappeared from his desk. Anonymous calls warned him off. A fellow officer muttered that orders from above had changed. "This case isn't ours anymore." Corruption. From inside. And then, another shock. A fisherman, walking the banks of the River Irwell, spotted something tangled in reeds. A body, bloated, unrecognizable, but with a wallet still in the jacket pocket. Daniel Mercer, or what was left of him. The man who had been the key to unlocking the case, silenced forever. Now there was no denying it. The chain led straight to London, to William Hawthorne, to a crime syndicate with influence deep inside Manchester's own police force. And the missing millions? Still gone, still hidden. But if Hawthorne had them, he wasn't just a criminal. He was untouchable. Or was he? The final episode of the Manchester Heist would decide that, because Keene was done following rules. If the system was compromised, he would have to break it before Hawthorne's shadow swallowed everything. Manchester, winter of 1980. The city lay under a low, gray sky. The Irwell ran black and swollen with rain. And Daniel Mercer, once the last living thread to the dockside robbery, was lowered into the ground under a drizzle that seemed endless. Only 3 mourners stood by. A mother, too frail to cry. A brother who clenched his jaw and refused to bow his head. And Detective Inspector Harold Keene, chain-smoking, collar up against the wet. The case should have ended there. The file closed. Another robbery marked unsolved. A dead thief. A city too afraid to name names. But for Keene, the story had only sharpened. Because in death, Mercer had given him the truth. The ledger, the whispers, the typed letter, all pointed to one man, William Hawthorne. The businessman, the London kingpin. The man who, in a glittering nightclub, had smiled as his men warned Keene to turn back. But could Hawthorne ever be touched? Keene tried. He pulled strings, reached out to contacts in Scotland Yard. The response was polite stone. "We'll look into it." Files went missing. Surveillance requests were denied. One night, his own superior called him in. "Drop it, Harry. That's an order." Keene stared at him, seeing in his eyes what he had long feared. Hawthorne's reach didn't end in smoky nightclubs or backroom gambling dens. It reached into Manchester's police, London's offices, maybe even Parliament itself. So Keene broke. Quietly, he began moving outside the force. He sought out Maria Doyle, widow of the tortured man. She lived now behind locked doors, curtains drawn. Her voice shook as she handed Keene a final piece of evidence, a photograph, black and white, taken at a wedding in London. There was her husband, laughing, and beside him, William Hawthorne. Proof, not just of knowledge, of intimacy. The Manchester crew had been pawns. Hawthorne had built the game from the beginning. The last weeks of 1980 were a blur of dead ends and close calls. Keene's cars followed. Once on Deansgate, he found his tires slashed. Another night, a brick crashed through his kitchen window with a note tied to it. "Stop digging, or you'll end up in the Urwell too." Still he pressed. He traced the missing millions. Rumors swirled. Cash smuggled in lorry shipments south, laundered through London nightclubs, some even hidden offshore. But nothing concrete. Only whispers. Only shadows. Until New Year's Eve, 1980. A call came. An informant, voice trembling, promising the location of one of the missing lockboxes from the docks. The meet was set at an abandoned textile mill outside Manchester. Keene went. Alone. The mill smelled of damp and rust. His footsteps echoed across cracked concrete. In the center, under a bare bulb, sat a metal crate. A lockbox, its paint flaking, but unmistakable. He approached, hands steady, heart pounding. The lid creaked open. Inside, empty. Just dust. And a note. Typed. Clean. White paper. "You don't chase shadows, Inspector. Shadows chase you. W.H." The crate had been bait. A warning. A reminder. Keene left the mill alive, but the message was clear. William Hawthorne would never face a dock, never sit in a cell, never answer a jury. The money was gone. The witnesses silenced. The case dead. The Manchester Heist faded into rumor, half-truth, and silence. Some said the money fueled London's underworld for decades. Others whispered that Hawthorne's empire collapsed in the 90s, eaten from within. But no one ever saw the millions again. And Hawthorne, he grew old. He grew rich. He died in a mansion by the sea, untouched. But the story did not disappear. It lived on in families torn apart, in widows like Maria Doyle, in cold stares across Manchester pubs whenever someone whispered the doc's job. It lived in the silence of men who had known too much and chosen never to speak. And it lived in Keene. Retired, bent with age, he still walked Manchester's gray streets, still smoked too much, still paused by the Urwell where Mercer had been found. He knew the truth, but the truth had never been enough. This was the story of the Manchester Heist, a robbery of millions, a trail of betrayal, blood, and silence, and the shadow of one man, William Hawthorne, who reminded a city that sometimes crime doesn't pay. It buys, and it buys everything.